We're closer to the moon right now than most people realize. Not in theory, not someday, right now. After decades of looking back at the moon like a finished chapter, something changed. Now it's starting to look like unfinished business. New missions, new images, new momentum. For the first time in a long time, going back doesn't feel symbolic anymore. And that raises a bigger question than people think. Not just can we reach the moon again, but how close are we to actually staying there? Because once that question stops sounding like science fiction, everything changes, and the moon starts feeling less like a destination and more like a possible second home. And the reason this no longer sounds crazy is simple. The moon isn't just out there, it's close enough to matter, close enough to reach, close enough to study, and now close enough that people are seriously asking what we could use once we get there. Because this stopped being just about flags and footprints a long time ago. Now the question is whether the moon has what a future outpost would actually need. Water changed that conversation, not all at once, but enough to make the idea of staying there feel less like fantasy and more like planning. And once you start talking about water, power, shelter, and repeat access, the moon stops feeling like a one-time mission. It starts feeling like the first real test of life beyond Earth. On paper, that starts to sound possible, maybe even more possible than most people expected. And that's exactly where this story starts getting dangerous. And once you let that idea in, the future starts getting easier to picture. Not a fantasy city, not some glowing sci-fi dream, just the first version of people actually living there. Small shelters, pressurized vehicles, power systems, surface routines. Not comfortable, not easy, but real enough to imagine. And that's what makes the moon so persuasive. It doesn't have to look perfect, it just has to look possible. Because the moment you can picture people working there, moving there, waking up there, the line between mission and home starts to blur. And that may be the most powerful part of this whole idea. For a few seconds, it starts to feel less like science fiction and more like the early blueprint of a second world. But this is where the dream starts running into something harder, because the moon doesn't become livable just because we can reach it. Step outside for even a moment and you're not in a world built for humans. You're in a place where survival has to be actively engineered second by second. And some of the danger isn't dramatic at all. You can't see it, you can't hear it, but that doesn't make it less real. Earth protects us in ways most people never have to think about. The moon doesn't do any of that, which means life there would depend on shells, seals, systems, and constant control, not just to stay comfortable, to stay alive. And if that already sounds fragile, the next problem gets even closer, because some lunar danger doesn't stay outside. And this is where the moon stops feeling dangerous in the obvious way, because one of its worst problems isn't massive, dramatic, or far away. It's dust. Not the kind people imagine, not soft, harmless dirt. Something sharper, more stubborn, more invasive. It clings to suits, it grinds against seals, it wears down the systems that are supposed to keep people alive. And the more often humans move through that environment, the worse that gets. But what makes it truly disturbing is that it doesn't just stay on the machinery, it comes back with you. Into the airlock, onto the surfaces, closer to the air people depend on. Which means a real moon base wouldn't just face this once, it would live with it over and over again. And that changes the whole picture, because now the danger isn't only outside the habitat, it's already trying to come in. And this is where the moon stops feeling harsh and starts feeling merciless. In direct sunlight, parts of the lunar surface can climb above 250 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's no atmosphere out there to soften any of it. Then the light disappears and the problem flips. In deep shadow, temperatures can fall below minus 410 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the moon, darkness isn't just night. In many places, it can mean long stretches where survival depends on whether your systems keep working the entire time. That's what makes this more dangerous than it first sounds. You're not just dealing with one extreme, you're trapped between multiple extremes with almost no room for failure. And after a while, that changes what living there really means. Because on the moon, survival wouldn't just be difficult, it would be non-stop. And this is the part people usually imagine the least. Because even if the systems work, the moon still has to work on the human mind. You'd be living in a sealed space, far from Earth, with even simple support no longer feeling instant. At the moon, one-way communication delay is about 1.3 seconds. Small on paper, but it changes the feeling of distance. Earth would still be there, close enough to see, far enough to feel. And NASA has spent years studying this for a reason. Isolation, confinement, sleep disruption, lower morale, harder decisions, those aren't side issues, they become part of the mission. Which means life on the moon wouldn't just test whether humans can survive the environment. It would test whether humans can keep functioning under pressure without slowly starting to break. And this is where the scale of the whole idea changes. Because keeping a few people alive on the moon is one thing. Building something that actually lasts is something else. A real outpost needs more than shelter. It needs power, water handling, storage, repairs, backup systems, and a support chain that never really gets to stop. And if too much of that has to keep coming from Earth, the whole system stays fragile. You're not building a second home. You're running a very expensive dependency. That's why NASA and its partners are already thinking beyond delivery, because a real lunar future probably means building with the moon itself. Roads, shields, landing pads, protective structures. The moment you start talking about those, you're not imagining a mission anymore. You're imagining the first rough version of a civilization. And that's exactly what makes this bigger than it first sounds. Because once the colony becomes real, the next question gets harder. Where would people actually be safest living there? And this may be the strangest turn in the whole story. Because the safest place to live on the moon might not be on the surface at all. The more scientists study lunar pits and caves, the more one idea keeps coming back. What if the real shelter is underground? That would change everything, because now the future stops looking like open bases under the sky and starts looking more like protected spaces buried from the world outside. In other words, a real moon home might feel less like a frontier town and more like a bunker built for survival. And once that idea clicks, the entire picture shifts. Maybe the question was never whether humans could live on the moon. Maybe it was whether they could live there without having to hide from it. And that may be the real truth hiding underneath all of this. The moon can start to look possible long before it starts to feel human. NASA can map the hazards. Engineers can solve part of the survival problem. But that still leaves a harder question. What exactly would count as living there? If your shelter has to seal you from radiation, shield you from impacts, protect you from temperatures above 250 degrees Fahrenheit and below -410, are you building a second home or a permanent survival machine? Maybe that's the real scientific question now. Not whether humans can reach the moon again, but whether life on the moon would ever feel like life, or only like surviving somewhere we were never meant to belong.